everybody. Welcome. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the balcony? Yes. Wonderful. So now that I can be heard, we will begin. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then this is going to be a conversation about issues that are very much on all of our minds, a conversation that these two extraordinary guests will be able to provide a very important input and insight into. Before the introduction, there's an introduction to the introduction, which is that I want to announce from a security perspective, in the unlikely event that we need to evacuate, we're going to ask you to pay close attention to the instructions that are given by our ushers. So this program is really part of an overall effort at Temple Israel for us to bring quality programs and quality conversations to our community. And our feeling is that it's important for us to deepen our understanding. We want to get beyond people coming to say things that I might agree with or you might agree with, and we applaud when we hear something that comports with our own perspective. We want to get to a place where we are really being challenged to think carefully about what we believe and about how we approach certain important and significant issues. So this is going to be an instance of trying to deepen our understanding and deepen the resolution with which we see these crucial issues. This program is made possible through a number of anonymous donations and also through a variety of funds that support adult education here at Temple Israel. I want to, at the outset, express my gratitude and thanks for a number of people who have been critical in the visioning and the implementation of this program. So a huge gratitude to Veronica Bisek-Lurby and Lynn Weitzman, two of our vice presidents. I'm grateful for the support of our outstanding professionals, staff under the direction of our executive director, Leon Silverberg. I want to express gratitude to Alan Ichkow for live streaming this program and doing everything technically that will allow that to take place, and it's also going to be recorded. And I also want to thank Neil Picker, the head usher, and all of those who have volunteered to serve as ushers for this morning. So I am now going to just take a moment to introduce my co-conversationalists. So, starting with, okay. So the Imam has graciously suggested that I start with Yossi. So I will begin by introducing Yossi Klein Halevi. And I'm going to give introductions that are really brief, and so much more can be said about both of these individuals, and you'll find out more about them over the course of this morning and hopefully beyond if you want to research it further. So Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He is an award-winning journalist. He has written a number of books, starting with Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, speaking about his own experience growing up and his own attraction to and subsequent disillusionment with Jewish militancy. He wrote a book called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, which is actually my introduction to his thinking, which is a description of his experience getting to know Christians and Muslims by how they congregate and how they pray. He wrote a book like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem. Diana and I, when we were in Israel with the Hartman Institute, had the pleasure of being guided by Yossi through the streets of East Jerusalem that the paratroopers traversed on their way to liberate Jerusalem. And most recently, he's the author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which is the plea for peace and renewed dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. And there is so much that can be said about Yossi, but I, as a rabbi, as a Jew, find myself again and again being awed by the thoughtful way that he parses complicated issues. He has a remarkable analytical capacity, and he also has a beautiful, creative, and spiritual identity that he's constantly seeking to renew and to enhance. And if you are searching for somebody who has right brain and left brain working beautifully in tandem, you don't have to go any further than Islam. We are also thrilled to welcome Imam Abdullah Antepli, who serves on the faculty of Duke University. He serves as the Chief Representative for Muslim Affairs and is on the Adjunct Faculty of Islamic Studies at Duke University. He actually initiated the role of Muslim chaplain at that university. And he is working to find avenues to provide a Muslim voice and perspective to issues of faith and justice and spirituality. And I had the opportunity to meet Imam Antepli in Jerusalem as well. It was the first summer that the two of these guests of ours started the Muslim Leadership Initiative. And he brings intellect and a great sense of humor and a beautiful open heart to all of the work that he has done that has really helped to start and to also grow very important conversations around engagement between Jews and Muslims and a whole host of other things. So that's the introduction. And we decided, the three of us, that instead of calling each other by our titles, that because we know each other, we're going to be on a first name basis, all three. So that, you should know, is something that we all determined, and this is how we are going to proceed.
And because I don't have any titles.
Conversation this morning. So I am going to start the conversation by asking each of you to reflect a little bit on your own backgrounds that have brought you to this point of serious Jewish-Muslim engagement, to speak about what it is in your own upbringing, what it is in the trajectory of your own intellectual and spiritual thinking and feeling that has led you to do this engaging work. How did Muslim Leadership Initiative get started? So if you would kindly address that to start off, and our two guests are deferring to each other, but by the time I'm done asking the question, I hope they will have decided who's going to go first.
Yeah, Abdullah, I don't want people to think that Jews have less manners than Muslims, so you go first.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Shabbat Tov. It's absolutely a distinct pleasure and honor to be in Great Neck, New York. I've never been here before. From my hotel to, I'm surprised, because from my hotel to here, I counted 11 synagogues. I thought I covered all the Jews in America, but somehow Great Neck was missing, and I have to do my Shechiani now. I am doing something new and first time and interesting. It is really a pleasure and honor to be here. I will be only speaking to microphone as I'm ordered, so I don't want to ignore the audience. There are two parts to your question, how we ended up in doing what we do. One is personal, and one is communal. My loyalty, my commitment, my love to my Muslim community, especially in the United States. And in both personal and communal part of what we are doing, I am running away from some fires, I'm running away from some monsters, but also I am attracted to, I am running towards potential good, I am seeing a city lit on the hilltop that I would like to reach. It's a both fear, but also in kind of an attraction, both on the personal and the communal front. How did I end up in Jewish-Muslim relations, which became central and significant part of my whole human life? Because I am not making this humorously. In all sincerity, I always consider myself, define myself as a recovering anti-Semite. Even though my brother every once in a while says, you recovered now. No, once you are exposed to hate so early in life, once hate comes and takes root in your consciousness, in your brain tissue so early in life, that's a lifelong struggle to recover. The secular, nationalist, chauvinistic secular education and upbringing that I had in Turkey when I grew up, it wasn't religious. Religion saved me. It was very, very anti-Semitic. The first book I read about Jews, Judaism, and Israel was the children's version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Children's version. And the second, and the second version, second book I read about Jews, Judaism is Henry Ford's International Jew.
Many people in America, they don't remember who that guy was. That book is illegal in the United States, but it's unfortunately and regretfully printed in many, as my good friend Jonathan Greenblatt knows, and distributed all over the world, especially in Muslim languages. And I read Mein Kampf. So before the age of 15, it wasn't a bias, it wasn't anger. I was made to believe that Jews as people, Judaism as religion, is irredeemably evil. I spent early teenage years burning Israeli flags on Palestinian protests. As I always have humorously say, it's good for Chinese economy. It used to buy those plastic Israeli flags and burn them. But Baruch Hashem, as we say, the God of mercy and compassion didn't allow me to live with that level of hate. Really, I would physically get sick when I see visibly Jewish symbols or visibly Jewish people. And then I became very religious, unlike my parents and family. I went into a madrasa to become an imam. And the mainstream studying, mainstream theology, mainstream Quran, mainstream life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, really slowed me down significantly. And ultimately, I had very wonderful teachers. Once I realized that I swallowed hate, once I realized that I had to recover from my racism, I became a very serious student of Jews and Judaism. That slowed me down. But ultimately, what made me take the nearest exit and drive in the opposite direction is meeting with God-fearing, God-loving Jews, like my holy brother Yosef Halevi. That human interaction. I was able to live outside of Turkey, travel, and then came to the United States about 20 years ago. I met people, and that really enhanced my ability to recover as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So when I personally, in my recovery process, I realized many members of my community is very vulnerable in the same situation as well. As I was trying to recover through my Jewish-Muslim relations work and my study of Judaism, Jews, halakha, and the beautiful tradition that you all are part of, the monsters of anti-Semitism that I'm running on the personal front also accompanied with how much I fell in love with Judaism, how much it was similar to my way of thinking. I fell in love with that level of monotheism, that it is similar to my tradition, but also articulated so eloquently in a very unique and different way. I fell in love. I have, in the interfaith world or cross-faith engagement work, there's a term you should all know, holy envy. Holy envy means you study other tradition, you study other cultures, and you see something so beautiful that you don't have. And then you create it as you knowledge and appreciation. You are jealous of that tradition. I have a long list of holy enemies in Judaism, but number one is absolutely Shabbat. And I wish more Jews would appreciate Shabbat, or at least would appreciate Shabbat as much as I do. It's an incredible thing. It's an incredible thing. I'm explaining, not only I was running away from my Muslim anti-Semitism, but it gradually became like a spiritual joy and feast. When the world's largest, most powerful, most influential religion, capitalism, is telling you 24/7, buy more, consume more, work harder, get more, and on, and then here's one tradition for the last 4,000, 5,000 years saying, once a week, don't do it. Once a week, stop. Once a week, center yourself around the important things, family, God, whatever. But it's an incredible, we have in Islam 5 daily prayers, Ramadan, but there's something so unique and powerful, which I wish could be, the essence of it would be more promoted. So both what I am doing, why I'm spending a significant part of my personal and professional in Jewish-Muslim relations, I am trying to still recover from the hate that I swallowed early on. And I want to see the richness of Judaism, how it's going to enhance my Islam. I am very happily Muslim. If I come back to work 1,000 times, I would choose Islam as a religion. I love this religion. It gets me out of my bed and start my work every day. But there is a way in which your Islam, my Islam, can be enriched by studying Judaism. And MLI program has deepened that successful interfaith interaction, how I can study and develop appreciation of Judaism, in the meantime simultaneously can get a better Muslim. Just quickly on the communal side, I am extremely worried about Muslim anti-Semitism. I am extremely worried about the way in which the relative coexistence between Jews and Muslims, historically speaking, it wasn't rosy, it wasn't egalitarian 21st century, but it was somewhat better than Christian Europe, the way the Jews and Muslims lived together. And despite incredible similarity of our moral framework in our traditions, we are not doing well. We are not doing well as Jews and Muslims. And that deterioration of relationship, especially after 1948, is giving rise to a despicable, destructive Muslim anti-Semitism, which not everyone become violent and etc. But the hate, if anything I learned from Judaism, Islam, and all the religions that I study, if hate goes unchallenged in any community, if hate goes unchallenged in any community, before it becomes a source of violence and destruction to other people, it erodes your own morals and ethics. It corrupts your own tradition. It internally destroys you. And so, on the communal side, I am trying to do everything I can within my power as a Muslim, as an Imam. The most of it I'm running away on the communal front is to find a way to improve the immune system of my community, improve the health of my community. The problem is so complicated when it comes to Muslim anti-Semitism is that many in my community don't even recognize it. Many, they don't even see it because it's so thinly veiled or thickly veiled behind political ideologies through Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Many do not know the difference, how you can criticize the state policies of Israel without crossing the line into anti-Semitism and therefore knowingly or unknowingly cross that border. But at the same time, it's not all fear. It's not only the monster that I'm running away from. In America, in North America, there is an incredible opportunity for us. There's an incredible prize. There's an incredible way to glorify God's name as two ethnic minority communities if we can put our acts together. FBI just released another hate report. I'm sure it's keeping Jonathan up at night. 90% of the hate, religiously hate, is against Jews and Muslims. Disproportionate against Jews, but 90% of it is against us. 90%. So there's a rising common enemy. There's a rising common ugly face of hate against both of our communities. But again, there is a way in which I will end with this note. One of my favorite songs, one of my favorite pieces in the Torah is when God asked Moses, tell the children of Israel, collect me gifts. Tell the children of Israel, but what kind of gift do you buy to the creator of everything that exists in the world? What would make Hashem smile? What would make God smile, Allah smile? There is a way in which I think the 20th century Christians and Jews, by reconciling Christianity and Judaism, by defeating 2,000 years of deeply rooted enmity, in many ways the relative reconciliation, relative defeat of Christian anti-Semitism is one of the most beautiful gifts that humanity has ever given to God. In the 21st century, especially in North America, I will say more maybe in the future, what I'm running towards, what I'm attracted to, the life that I see that we can arrive at as two ethnic and religious minority communities, in the 21st century, we are morally called to pack and deliver a similar gift to God by reconciling Judaism and Islam and Jewish-Muslim relations. And if this is the moral responsibility, the closest people to pack this gift are North American Jews and North American Muslims, but it's still in a potential state. I hope we can arrive there, and inshallah we will.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for that encapsulation. There's a lot of deeper digging that we'll hopefully be able to do about Muslim anti-Semitism, about Christian anti-Semitism, what might that need to mean for Islam if we're going to look at some parallels between what many in the Christian world have done to be able to move past that, so that it can take place not just in North America, but in places across the ocean, which are very dangerous for Jews and for other people, partly due to radical Islam. So I want to circle back to that. but certainly getting American Jews and Muslims to engage with each other is a very important part of, as you're putting it, a cosmic gift that we can offer. So, Hazak Baruch. Thank you for your comments. So, Yossi, you started in Brooklyn as a strong proponent of the Jewish Defense League. You came from a different place than you are now. And if you would take a few moments to address your journey, what has brought you to a space of recognizing the importance of Jewish-Muslim engagement, notwithstanding how complex and fraught we all know it to be?
So, good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here for all kinds of reasons. First of all, to be sharing your pulpit. It's really wonderful to be with you, and after our years of friendship, so I'm really happy to be here. And with my brother Abdullah, we actually don't do this very often. And so this is really a rare opportunity for us to unpack a process that has really been intuitive in some sense for both of us, and to really try to explicitly name what has happened. And to be here with friends in the audience, with Jonathan and Marja. I'm just really delighted to be back in Great Neck with both of you. So my story, as you've let out of the bag, is that I was a teenage extremist. I grew up in a Holocaust survivor family in Borough Park. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a Jewish neighborhood. And at that time, it was probably the world's largest concentration of survivors. My family was a survivor family from Hungary. And I was raised by a very angry survivor, a survivor who made his anger explicit. I think many of my friends' parents were really trying to move on, and my father felt that you can't just move on and pretend as if that hadn't happened. And he was looking for an audience to explain what his experiences were, and there was no audience in America of the 1950s for a survivor story, except for me, his firstborn. And so my father raised me very intensively on his stories, and he raised me to be a kind of a vicarious survivor, to be a kind of contemporary of his, not just to be a carrier of his memory, but in some way to inhabit his memory. And he felt his mission was to try to prevent me from being what he referred to as a stupid American. And a stupid American is someone who doesn't understand that the world is an evil place. And so that's how I was raised. And I internalized my father's worldview. And that worldview was that the world essentially is divided into two. There are the non-Jews who actively want to destroy us, and there are the non-Jews who are passively glad that others are doing the work. That basically was my understanding of the world. Not surprisingly, I gravitated to the hard right. I started in the Beitar youth movement, the Zionist youth movement of Begin, Jabotinsky, but that wasn't enough for me. And eventually I found my way to Meir Kahane. And I spent most of my high school years out of high school, on the streets, at the Soviet mission, in and out of jail, in and out of court, eventually in several countries, including the Soviet Union. And so it was really a youth that was pretty much what my father in some sense had hoped. He didn't want me to go to prison, but it was very much a non-American youth. Although in some sense it was the 60s, and perhaps it was in America. It was a Jewish version of what was happening out in the American 60s, but a very specific Jewish version of the 60s. For various reasons, a long story, I began to realize that I was actually not a surrogate survivor, And growing up as an American Jew in the 60s of all times, which was really the moment in American history when everything opened up, everything seemed possible. And I was very much part of the 60s as well, the music, the culture of the 60s. And I began to realize that there is this disparity between how I see myself and what my actual reality is as an American-born Jew growing up with the state of Israel, being privileged to be part of the first generation to be born with a Jewish state as a reality. And I came to realize that the difference between my generation, which was the most fortunate generation of Jews in history, and my father's generation, which was the least fortunate generation of Jews in history, that the gap between us should not have really been measured in decades, but in centuries. Because psychically, we inhabited two completely opposite realities. And what's extraordinary in Jewish history is that these two realities happen immediately one after the other. I think it is the most extraordinary moment in Jewish history, to go from our lowest point to our most empowered place, which is Jewish life today. And so it took a while for that to sink in. And as Abdullah said about himself, I would say that I'm a recovering extremist. A friend of mine calls himself, from those years, a friend of mine calls himself a recovering Jewish fascist. I wouldn't use that terminology, but certainly a recovering Jewish extremist. And I don't think one can ever fully recover from that immersion in rage at such an early age, but it is an ongoing process. The next stage in my recovery process was moving to Israel in 1982, and then being drafted into the Israeli army, and eventually serving in the Gaza refugee camps during the first Intifada of the late 1980s. And the first Intifada was the moment when my generation of Israelis, or many of us, came to realize that it's complicated. And serving in the Gaza refugee camps was my wake-up call that something different needs to happen. But on a deeper personal level, what the Gaza experience did for me was free me of any lingering emotional attachment to the identity of victim. Now, I despise the left-wing critique of Israel as victimizer. It's much more complicated than that. But going through being a soldier in the refugee camps in the first Intifada made it impossible for me any longer to see myself as a victim. And that was actually liberating. I would say that Zionism's hard gift to the Jewish people was to give us power and to force us to own responsibility for power. And so being an Israeli really helped me internalize what I think of as the core of the Israeli ethos, which is to despise the identity of victim. Israelis do not see themselves as victims. We don't want that identity. We reject it. And as a result of that, we've created what I think is a very healthy generation. I think our kids have really, to a great extent, been freed of 2,000 years of psychological and actual victimhood. So having been freed of that burden of victimhood allowed me to begin to think of a different kind of relationship between the Jewish majority in Israel and the Muslim and Christian minorities. To put it another way, this was the first time in Jewish history when the dynamic had been reversed. We are now in control. We are the majority. And many Jews, certainly I think in the diaspora, haven't fully internalized the Zionist revolution. And so I felt, if I'm part of the Jewish majority, I have an opportunity now to explore Christianity and Islam in a way that Jews never could before, because we were always a minority. And I remember when so I decided to write a book, to go on a journey as a religious Israeli Jew into Christianity and Islam, into the faiths of my neighbors. This was the late 1990s. And I remember telling my agent in New York that I'm planning to write this book. And she said, "Aren't you concerned about your children?" And I didn't understand the question at first. I said, "Pam, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, you're going to be bringing Christianity and Islam into the home." I said, "Pam, we're the majority here. We don't have to worry about assimilation and Christmas trees." And so it was one of those moments where it really reinforced for me just how privileged I was to be an Israeli, that I could explore Christianity and Islam with all of the baggage that I have. I have 2,000 years of emotional baggage toward Christianity because of my family background, and I have emotional baggage toward Islam because of my Israeli citizenship. And so I don't come to either of these religions easily. But I went on this journey. I went into mosques, I went into monasteries with a kippah, and I wrote this book about what I learned about both Christianity and Islam. And it's not an easy book. It's not what Abdullah's favorite word, kumbaya. It's not a kumbaya. Abdullah hates kumbaya. It's one of the things we have in common. It's not a kumbaya book. Maybe a little kumbaya is not bad. So the book was published, the account of this journey into the faiths of my neighbors was published on September 11th, 2001. That was the pub date. I was in Manhattan that morning because we were going to have a launching party at my agent's apartment that night, needless to say. And the book completely died, it just disappeared. And the truth is that I was actually relieved to see that book disappear, because meanwhile, the second Intifada had begun in Israel in 2000. The second Intifada was emotionally and politically the opposite experience for my generation as the first Intifada. The first Intifada, many of us learned that the left had been correct about occupying another people. You can't rule over another people and still be a Jewish majority and democratic state. The left won that argument in the first Intifada, but the right won the argument in the second Intifada that you can't make peace with a Palestinian national movement that doesn't accept our legitimacy. And that's true for all parts of the Palestinian national movement, from Fatah, the PA, to Hamas, and points in between. And so the second Intifada was that moment when the Israeli right won the argument about the peace. And so I found myself, like a majority of Israelis, in this very strange limbo where I came to see a Palestinian state in two opposite ways. On the one hand, it was an existential need for Israel to be freed from the occupation. We needed to free ourselves from the occupation and create a Palestinian state. On the other hand, a Palestinian state became an existential threat. Another way to put it, and this I think is true today, this is how I think a majority of Israelis would put it, and I suspect if you had an off-the-record conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he would say something similar. We need a Palestinian state, and we can't create a Palestinian state. That's our dilemma. Another way that I would put it is that I have two nightmares about a Palestinian state. The first is that there won't be, and the status quo continues another 50 years. And the second, you can help me out here, is that there will be. So that's, as a result of the two Intifadas together, that's where I was. The last thing that I was interested in doing after the second Intifada was engaging with Muslims. It was the farthest thing from my mind. I'd written this book, going into mosques and having this deep reverence, love for Islam. And then the Second Intifada comes after Israel had offered to create a two-state solution. We get the worst wave of terrorism in our history, and something of my teenage years kicked in again. That's why I say recovering. And I wanted nothing to do, not with Palestinians, not with Muslims. And fate has a way of playing tricks with us. A couple of years after my book was published, I get an email from somebody with the name that I didn't recognize, Imam Abdullah Entebli. Hi, I read your book. Now, you know the writer's joke, oh, you're the one, you know? Well, we actually have two of you here. Two of you have read that book. It's an extraordinary moment for me as a writer. And so Abdullah writes me, you know, I loved your book. I was so moved by the respect you showed for Islam, and I want to undertake a reciprocal journey into Judaism. And I'm coming to Israel. I'm bringing a group of students from, at that time he was the Muslim chaplain at Wesleyan. I'm bringing Muslim and Jewish students, and I want them to meet with you. Now, I knew this was a setup, because Abdullah thought he was inviting the author of that interfaith book. But the person who showed up was a very typical angry Second Intifada Israeli. And what I said to his group was, there's no hope. Forget about it. It's never going to happen. It's a waste of time. Forget that book. It's wrong. And Abdullah, who I since learned is a very patient and stubborn man, said to me, that's how you feel now. But you and I are going to work together to help heal the Muslim-Jewish wound. And my response to you was, good luck. Good luck with that. Fast forward 10 years later, and with this I'll end this part of the story.
It was a hard day. 10 years.
Yeah, it's really like Jacob pursuing Rachel. And so there, 10 years later, I'm now a fellow at the Hartman Institute, which is where Howard and I connected. And Abdullah comes to a conference, a theology conference at Hartman, and he says, I'd like to start a program, and I'd like it to be housed at Hartman. We will bring young, emerging Muslim American leaders to come to this Israeli Zionist institution, and you will teach us what Israel, Jewish peoplehood, Zionism means to Jewish identity. And I want you to be my co-director. And I said, sure, no problem, because I was sure nothing would come of it. And he said, and I want this to be at Hartman, and with all of the authority that was not invested in me, I said, no problem. And a few weeks later, Abdullah sends me an email with a who's who list. Young emerging writers, and the editor of the first Muslim American women's magazine, and Muslim chaplains from Yale and Northwestern, and extraordinary. And so I go to Daniel Hartman, the president of the Institute. I said, Daniel, we have a problem here. They seem to be serious. And so we put together a curriculum. I sent it to Abdullah, and he sent it back to me. He says, this is wrong. He said, don't give me a typical Hartman curriculum on Judaism. I want more Zionism in there. He says, my community's problem is we're not coming to agree with Israeli government policies. It's not going to be a Hasbara trip. Don't expect us to agree with you about Gaza. But I want you to teach us why Jews feel that Israel is essential to their identity. And so we recreated the program, and we've graduated over 100 emerging Muslim American leaders. That's applause for this guy here. And we are, God willing, bringing in our 6th cohort in January, and we're on to the next 100.
Thank you, Mr. Good.
Thank you.
introduction. And now I'm going to introduce the second part, which I will title, Are You Both Nuts? And I'm going to unpack what I mean by that. So first of all, MLI is a program that brings together leading and emerging leading Muslims from North America to Israel, and Yossi started to speak about that, and perhaps we'll hear more. Also, by way of introducing this community, this congregation and this community is very diverse. It is diverse politically. It is diverse ideologically. We have people here who come from Eastern European backgrounds. We have people here who grew up in Iran, people who grew up in Iraq, who lived among Muslims and who have had very strong encounters and engagements with Muslims their entire lives. And so what I have learned about this congregation is that while the richness and the diversity of the congregation can initially make it seem inhibiting, I want you to feel liberated to continue to say exactly what you feel about all of the complicated issues, because I guarantee you, whatever you say, somebody will agree and somebody will disagree, and so that's been my joyful experience of being the rabbi here for these last 15 years.
I can tell so many Jewish jokes here, but I won't.
Now maybe the Jewish jokes perhaps we can save for the final segment of the program. So I wanted to address candidly the challenges that MLI has faced, that this Muslim Leadership Initiative has faced. So I am imagining that you, Abdullah, are getting pushback from the Muslim community. How are you bringing people, impressionable, emerging leaders, to live among and to hear from the occupiers of our people? I am sure, Yossi, that you are hearing people say, why are you advocating for greater engagement with Muslims? Think about 9/11, maybe that was a message from who knows what realm that your book appeared on the day that Islamic extremist hatred led to so many deaths. We now have, and will name, a number of newly elected people in Congress who have spoken out about Israel as being an apartheid state, and now they have entered into the halls of Congress. There are people here, I am certain, that are concerned about that. So all of the pushes and pulls that you are receiving from your respective communities and from other communities, are you nuts, as it were, to continue to do this work? But mostly, can you reflect and speak to each other, interrupt each other? This is a synagogue. We sometimes interrupt one another. We talk over each other. Feel free. What are the challenges that MLI has faced in these regards and others? Let us know.
The short answer to that question is yes. Before MLI, as I was shopping for a Jewish partner, and then Yossi kept saying no to me, I went back to Israel many times. Because my community understood and respected, to a certain extent, Judaism as a religion. That was not the problem. That wasn't feeding Muslim anti-Semitism. That wasn't polarizing Jews and Muslims globally. What's polarizing us is Zionism, Israel, and that's why we need to, even if we don't agree, we have to have a better understanding of this issue. So I have been to Israel many times. Not only I'm nuts, but I'm also very sufficiently high-level masochistic. And if you are a Muslim, for understandable and ununderstandable reasons, if you go through Ben Gurion, you go through a hell of a time. It was, the second time was the worst. I went in, it took 7 hours, a lot of interrogation. On my way out, it took 9 hours. I spent the night at the Ben Gurion. And because I raised my voice to this 23-year-old lovely woman, she was asking me the million times the same question that I don't know. And I said, like, what is this? And then she said, okay, strip search. Took me to the floor down, and they kept me in a room. That's one of the most humiliating experiences I've ever really gone through. They kept me completely naked in an open area room. And I said, at least can you only allow male soldiers to come? I've never been naked in the presence of anyone for opposite gender, etc. And I asked the soldier, why are you doing this to me? He said, so that you will never come back again. So that we will...
That worked.
I said, you only made me more committed to what I'm trying to do.
Wow.
I know you're a 23-year-old scared person. I'm not going to dehumanize you. I'm not going to dehumanize your country, your army. It only confirms how serious our problems are. That's why I appreciate Howard. Let's talk about the problems. Our problems are not easily solvable problems. These are decades in making, if not centuries in making. And one thing I hope your invitation invites all of us is, don't trivialize. It's not that few politicians can fix this overnight. It's not that if you only talk about kosher chicken, halal chicken, somehow we'll be friends. It's not like that. There are very serious problems on all sides trying to divide us, polarize us, that it requires a seriousness. And I received incredible amount of pushback, but similar to my experience at Ben Gurion Airport, the pushback from social media lynching campaigns into character assassinations into multiple death threats.
And in specific, you have received?
Yeah.
Okay.
FBI parked in front of my house for weeks. And my wife...
That's the FBI. The FBI was part.
FBI, because it was very credible death threats to me, to my children, stating that we will make you feel the way Gazans are feeling. And when I'm in Jerusalem, in Israel, with the MLI, my wife had to stay in a hotel because FBI said we can provide security for you, but not necessarily the same way to your family while they are there. But again, in the spirit of being not and masochistic, it only should make us really slow down and reflect on why is it this? Why that level of anger? And for two reasons. If I would have done this program in Great Neck, New York, which is the largest Jewish city apparently in New York, if I would have taken my people, my community, the participants in a Jewish institution in America and learned about Judaism, Zionism, and Israel, none of this could have happened. The fact that we are going to Israel, the fact that we are going there and trying to understand, trying to make sense of what Israel, Judaism, and Zionism means to many North American Jews. This is one source of the anger, which I can say more. The second is the participants, many of them, if not all of them, are currently or potentially mainstream American and Canadian Muslim leaders. They have a standing, they have a credibility in the Muslim community. We are not the first Muslims to go to Israel, but the other Muslims who have gone through different organizations, and they tend to be people who Muslim community do not know who they are. They don't have any connection. They don't have any standing or credibility in the Muslim community. Because the mainstream Muslim leaders are participating in this program, and because we are doing it in Israel, that was the two major source of tension. But I will let Yusuf say a few more, but I have a lot more to say in this regard.
So the truth is that I don't feel that I can answer that question. In fact, I don't feel that question should be addressed to both of us, because the price that Abdullah has paid and the courage and the sacrifice that Abdullah has showed is really the story of MLI. My experience has been, on the whole, beneficial. I've gained, I've deepened. There's been some Jewish skepticism about MLI, some sarcasm, but that's it. You know, I haven't faced any real pushback.
I'm sorry, can I just push back on that before you continue? So, Israeli leadership, has anybody in the Israeli government, do they kind of like poo-poo it, patronize it, or do they, or have they identified that there are some positive things?
We've had
far right-leaning members of the.
They're not aware of the program. And yeah, well, the truth is, even though it happens in Israel, the ultimate goal of the program is to facilitate relations between American Jews and American Muslims. The goal of the program is not me, it's you. I'm kind of the means for helping train Muslim American leaders to be able to engage with local Jewish communities around the country, and that's what we're actually doing now. But really, I'd say that so from the Jewish side, when Abdullah came to me with this idea and we decided to do it, I went to see two Jewish foundations, one liberal, one conservative, and that was a deliberate choice because I wanted there to be input from both parts of the Jewish community, because I saw this and still see this as a cross-political Jewish interest, as I think it is a cross-political Muslim interest, whether or not everyone in the Muslim community sees it that way. But I wanted to have a right-wing foundation and a left of center and a right of center foundation. And I approached these two foundations, and literally within 10 minutes of the conversation with each of them, the money was secured. And I think that says something about this deep hunger in large parts of the Jewish community for a different kind of relationship in this country between Muslims and Jews. And so I have really found open doors, half open doors, very few closed doors. Where I have had emotional difficulties is, of course, being engaged for the last 6 years with a very difficult group of students of Zionism. These are people, for the most part, who are not predisposed to liking Israel. As we would say in Hebrew, b'lashon hama'ata, it's an understatement. Many of them were BDS activists in college. And the kinds of questions and pushback that I deal with in the program requires a great deal of deep breathing and meditation. And just this last week, last Shabbat, we had our what I call our Muslim Shabbaton, our annual reunion of MLI alum. And we had a whole session of people complaining about the op-eds that I wrote and Daniel Hartman and others at the Institute wrote defending Israel during the Gaza riots. And it was a very difficult session, but that's MLI. Those are the kinds of conversations we have.
I think if I can say a few words more, why the rejection, opposition, and attack in the Muslim community is much greater, much stronger. Two reasons. One, the program is really challenging the status quo of the American Muslim community's understanding of Zionism, Israel. It's clear. Because for the most part, because we don't have ongoing relationship with the pro-Israeli Zionist Jewish community in the United States in the way in which we have a relationship with anti-Zionist Jewish communities, there was an unwritten litmus test or a red line established that you don't go there, you don't cross that line. That Zionism was its attack in the Muslim community was not that I am pro-Zionist or I'm trying to promote Zionism, but to put so much negative connotation to that word and equate it to racism very quickly. It was pretty much understood. That's really one of the reasons why certain litmus tests and red lines is crossed through this program. That's why there's a huge uproar. Secondly, also, the context. The American Muslim community feels incredibly deceived. American Muslim community, my community is suffocating in the last couple of years. After 9/11, but especially in the last couple of years. Immediately after 9/11, people, Americans, who have negative views of Islam and Muslims in 2002 was about 21%. All the polls. It's like 57, 58%. In some states, in some political parties, in some faith communities, it's 90%. The 2016, when Obama was leaving the office, 29% of Americans still believe that he was a Muslim. After 8 years of eating bacon, drinking wine, and going to church, 1/3 of Americans still believe that he was a Muslim and that was a bad thing. It's not 1/3 of Americans.
He was a bad Muslim.
According to these people. For a lot of people who are so angry about the MLI program and therefore all these attacks, it feels like as if there's a program happening to us. And a group of Muslims are saying, let's try to make sense of the Tsar. Let's try to make sense of in their mind, the attack is Judeo-Christian attack. The attack is the whole world And the Jewish footprint, Jewish involvement, Jewish presence in the anti-Muslim hate production machine, which is important and significant, is blowing up that perception that the Jews and Muslims are teaming up against the Muslim community, trying to create
Jews and Christians.
Jews and Christians, yeah. So one of these external suffocation, and the second, like this program, the Jewish version of MLI would be extremely controversial if a group of the mainstream Jewish leaders would come and say, let's try to make sense of weakness. Let's try to make sense of where the certain hate is coming in the Palestinian community. Let's go and study where they're coming from. That's how they perceive. Many people perceive the program as someone you are trying to make sense of the enemy.
But the good news here really is that MLI broke the stigma in parts of the Muslim American community for partnering with the pro-Israel Jewish community. We're seeing it on the local level, we're seeing it on the national level. And that, I really give Abdullah the credit for this, because Abdullah was the pioneer, the one who really broke the taboo.
So I want to just first react to some of what's been said, and then to lead us into a conversation about what's going on college campuses across this country, because that's something that many of us in the room, if not all, are very concerned about. So first of all, I know, Abdullah, that you have spoken about, and if it was a private conversation that I'm outing now, I apologize to the streamer and to whoever else is going to hear this, but you have actually talked aloud about bringing rabbis to Turkey to learn about Islam, to have a reverse initiative that would actually bring rabbis to a Muslim country. Obviously, there are so many Muslim countries, and each one has its own unique dynamics. So that would be interesting. Morocco might be an interesting choice. So it would be interesting to see how the Jewish community would respond, how synagogues would feel about their rabbis going to Morocco or to Turkey to learn about Islam and to actually be in the midst of those countries. So that would be the parallel and the equivalent to some degree. There are no perfect parallels. The other observation that I want to make is that there's such an interesting dynamic around majority and minority. Because majority and minority often are not just about numbers, it's about perception. And so the Muslims in the United States will, as you've said, often look to the Jews as being a majority, embodying whiteness, for example, which is a very loaded term these days. That the Jews have arrived in a way that Muslims might perceive that they have not yet arrived. And so is the Jew an ally that is also a minority, or is the Jew the majority oppressor, whether it's the majority in Israel or whether it's the cultural majority here in the United States? And I think those are just very interesting threads that I know that you're managing in a very forthright and very subtle way. So I want to take us to college campuses. And we were talking about this a little bit in my office earlier. I imagine that most in the room, and I know that many in the room, are concerned about what's happening on college campuses from the perspective of parents and grandparents of Jewish students, are worried about the threat of BDS, worried about students who are pro-Israel in any manifestation of that being vilified and demonized by a strong opposition to that. There is also concern, as we spoke about assimilation into the larger culture, about Jewish students abandoning their traditions, etc. So, Abdullah, I'm going to ask you primarily, but Yossi, by all means, you have a great deal of interaction with students across North American campuses to address how do you understand these threats, to give your perspective as the Muslim chaplain, because I dare say that Muslim parents also are concerned that their children not abandon their traditions and that they not assimilate. If you could address these issues and we could engage, that would be a great
I'll start with the last one, how Jews and Muslims so similar in their place in America, despite all the differences that we have. It is a joy. I've been a college Muslim chaplain for almost 20 years now here in the United States, at Hartford Seminary, Wesleyan University, Duke University. Always, late August, early September, it's an amazing joy. You welcome a new class of freshmen with incredibly worried and anxious parents. They come, they drop their sons and daughters, they turn around the corner and weep for about an hour, and then they come and visit me. And they say three things consistently. Imam, make sure you take attendance on Friday. Make sure my son and my daughter will show up at least once a week in your horizon, at the Jummah services, Friday services. Second, make sure they will date with a Muslim guy or girl. Ideal opposite gender. make sure they will, as if like as part of my imam, I'm a speed dater, or I have to turn the Muslim life that you can take dating scene. And the third is make sure they will go to medical school. I understand the first two. For God's sake, as an imam, my job is to make sure. And when that doesn't happen, and they doesn't go to medical school, I get into literal problem. Two families officially complained to the university that I failed in my mission of sending their children to medical school. BDS and college family, that's my wife, and I have a senior high school daughter who's going to college, and she's applying to all the West Coast schools. She wants to be as far away from home as possible. And we are hoping that doesn't mean anything other than just she wants to be an independent person. She still loves us. But it's in my immediate family. And she wrote to all the colleges that she applied to the Muslim community, MSA's, Muslim Student Association. I'm applying to this college. My religion is incredibly important for me. I want to make sure I have a vibrant, dynamic Muslim community for the colleges that I'm planning to. And it's so interesting. Of course, the response is always very gracious, but the UC Berkeley MSA wrote back to her saying, is your last name Antepli and you're from North Carolina? Are you that imam's daughter? And she said, yes. And she said, the person said, we had very spirited conversations about your father's work on our campuses. And she wrote back saying, I know, and I'm proud of what he does, and I'm looking forward to being part of those conversations. So, what I'm about to say shouldn't be come across as dismissive. I will say a few paradoxical things. I am not a fan of BDS, but I respect people's participation in it. I respect people's choice, seeing this if they are doing it in a non-violent and peaceful way.
No, I think you should, no, please let him finish speak.
Yeah.
If it is, I made a very big if there. Second, because of BDS provocations, I received multiple death threats. BDS, because of the work that I do, put a sign and has been attacking me all along. But I find, having said all of this, I find that certain Jewish reactions to BDS, forgive me if this makes you uncomfortable, incredibly exaggerated, misguided. I just thought, and I'm a bit frustrated by this. And what BDS has become now is partially a self-inflicted wound, as far as the Jewish community is concerned, that overreaction, giving a lot of oxygen, giving a lot of platform coverage, it says more about the Jewish community than the BDS itself. I wish in its early years it could have been benign neglect. Because if you ask the BDS people, what is your measure of success? Economically, it's not working. It's a joke. According to their own numbers, in 2015 or 16, the total damage to Israeli economy is about $37 million. Only HP in that year invested $2 billion into Israeli economy. So what is your measure of success? Since it's not working economically, their measure of success is Jewish pride, Jewish reaction. Look, if it wasn't working, would they react the way they do? They are passing laws in Israel. They are preventing people coming into the country, etc. Their only measure of success is the Jewish reaction to BDS. I wish that reaction would have been a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more subtle, a little bit more chill. I have to say this. I have to get this out of my mind. But it's too late now. Whatever it is, it's a reality. It's a force. It is dividing Jews and Muslims in many categories. And I would say the second thing. For many Jewish brothers and sisters, they think BDS is completely homogeneously pro-Palestinian Muslim. They either do not know or underestimate how diverse this political movement is. with a lot of Jewish members in it, with a lot of Jews and Jewish members in it. Many Jewish students who come to college and who feel the organized Jewish community is forcing a very partisan pro-Israeli line, once they don't find a respectful space where they can air their disagreement about Israel or its policies towards Palestinians, they very quickly turn and join the BDS movement. On my campus, 75% of it is Jewish students. It's faculty advisors is Israeli. In many places, that's absolutely the case.
Just to make sure to amplify, clarify, so 75% of the people, students and faculty who are involved with BDS at Duke University are Jewish.
And I have still respect within them. Whenever there's a problem, they invite me to be an arbitrator. And all the time it turns into an internal inter-Jewish argument. And Muslims, including Palestinians, become like a spectator. A group of Jews shouting at each other. It is, as they say in your country and in the Middle East, it's a lot more complicated than black and white. Do not essentialize anything, including BDS, or this is essentially black and white. This is essentially a fight between good and evil, and that side is completely evil and this side is good. It's not like that. Nothing is like that in general. I wish the Jewish community's reaction, throwing money, resources, would have been less of a recruiting partisanship, less of a recruiting foot soldiers into this political battle, proxy battle, staying on college campuses, would have been creating a space where there is a 2 mile between criticizing the state of Israel and anti-Semitism. Within 2 miles, you can organize Jewish community heroes. If they would have created this space, a lot of meaningful conversation could have happened, but that space in Monday college campuses is only 2 inches. Despite all the hype, everything I said, still, if you ask UC Berkeley, UCLA, their BDS activism is the largest. If you ask them, what's the number of students? What's the number of students involved? It's no more than few dozens, few hundreds, still within the student population of 40,000 people. There is still to me, deserving attention is given still to this. There are more Jewish students and Muslim students living the faith altogether. There are more Jewish and Muslim students checking out for all sorts of different reasons. I wish some of our attention, some of our resources would have gone to address why are they leaving? Why are they leaving the faith altogether? Why are they spending our precious time, energy, and focus on those issues and focusing and obsessing ourselves with this issue? It is not helpful. It is backfiring. It is pushing more Jewish students to BDS and Student for Justice in Palestine. I have one more to say, but my brother is sticking.
Yes, would you like to?
Oh, I certainly would. One of the great things about MLI is not only what we agree on, but what we disagree on. Because what we've managed to do in MLI is model a relationship of friendship and mutual respect when we have deep disagreements. And sometimes those disagreements, like now, are profound. I see BDS precisely in black and white terms. I see BDS as evil. I see BDS as a major threat, not to the state of Israel, but to American Jewry. It's not a threat to the state of Israel because, as you note, the Israeli economy has only thrived since the advent of BDS. But it is a tremendous threat to American Jewry because it is creating an atmosphere where young American Jews don't feel comfortable. And you know, as you all know, there's a growing argument among American Jews about which threat is greater. Is it the far right or the far left? And my answer to that question is that the far right poses a greater lethal threat to the lives of individual Jews in this country, but the far left is a greater existential threat to the long-term well-being of the Jewish people as a collective, because the far left has declared war against the legitimacy of the Jewish story. And my definition of who the Jews are is that we are a story that we tell ourselves about who we think we are. And that's why the Seder is the essential Jewish ritual that even distanced Jews will somehow participate in, because that's the moment when we tell our story again. And the far left has declared war against our story. So I see BDS as the threat of BDS goes far beyond numbers or immediate impact on campus. I've just concluded a 2-week campus tour with a young Palestinian, actually. And maybe I'll say a word or two about that in a moment. But when I went to different campuses and I asked about BDS, and everyone, the local heroes were saying, no, it's not so bad, it's only 20 or 30 students, but it's an atmosphere. And BDS's great success is that it has placed a big question mark over the words Israel and Zionism. And so Zionism now, we have to prove that Zionism isn't racism. In Israel, we have an expression, go prove that you don't have a sister. I won't explain the context of that saying, but you can use your imagination. Go prove you don't have a sister. And so go prove that Zionism doesn't have a sister. And that's really and it's a historic achievement of BDS. And I'm upset that the American Jewish community's reaction is not more effective, is not more unified, is not more decisive. The last thing I want to see is for the American Jewish community to tone down the intensity over BDS. So maybe I'll just say a word about this campus tour, since I'm really just coming off of a 10-campus tour. Most of those campuses I visited together with a young Palestinian man named Walid Issa, who is actually a friend of both of ours. I grew up in a refugee camp near Bethlehem in Dheisheh, came to the States to study, and I recently wrote a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which you mentioned, but the book is not just an attempt to reach out and create dialogue with Palestinians. The deeper move of the book is to defend Zionism and the Jewish story to our neighbors in the Middle East and more broadly in American society. And the first Palestinian to write me a letter in return was Walid. And I suggested to him, why don't we, and it was a terrific letter, accepting the premise of two indigenous, legitimate narratives in the land that we both inhabit. And so I said, why don't you and I do a campus tour, and let's model this conversation. And so we did, and we survived relatively intact. And, a bit of discomfort, but nothing really threatening. In a way, I felt disappointed. I felt, don't we count? Why does Michael Oren get threatened? And, why don't, but.
Somebody throw something.
So it was a very interesting experience to see how a Palestinian and an Israeli showing up on an American campus. And we were on major campuses. We were at Boston University, we were at Harvard, Tufts, University of Chicago, Northwestern. And to see how deeply confused young Americans are about this issue. And what Walid and I were modeling was a very complicated conversation. And that's what we do in MLI. We model complicated dilemmas. And we were such a profound challenge to the simplistic narrative that has set in on campus. And my hope is that we succeeded in confusing large numbers of students and to take this further on the road.
I'm glad we are modeling the respectful and to me profound disagreement that we have between us. Again, with my holy brother, because of him, because of my trust to him, I put all my personal and professional eggs in his basket. But I agree.
Good luck with that, as we say.
I strongly disagree to see BDS or any political activist movement, black and white term. In America, any essentialized attempt to silence any conversation, if I read American history correctly, shouting down or anything that become even remotely like a censorship and affecting and violating freedom of speech, I don't think it has a place in the social fabric of American civic society. It's not going to work. I agree that BDS's real danger and destruction is atmosphere, but the dialing up, that anxiety, those fears, constant obsessing ourselves is contributing to the atmosphere that we absolutely should reconsider. How can we be a little bit more effective, even if we think BDS is the worst thing in the world? Whatever the Jewish communities, organized Jewish community response is doing, it's making things worse. It's a case study how you can obsess yourself with it, throw a lot of money and make things worse. But that's exactly how I see it. On college campuses, including Duke University, where the Jewish community and the Muslim community has an ongoing relationship. And if they have ongoing relationship yielded, sophisticated, healthy connection, where they can actually talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Hillel and the MSA or the Muslim chaplain like Duke University, if you have an ongoing relationship, marginal far right and far left, including BDS, becomes almost insignificant. They cannot penetrate into the mainstream community. They become almost like a joke to 3 students doing mock apartheid week celebrations or walls, etc. What we need to invest is to creating that healthy space where Jews and Muslims can disagree, can air their legitimate dissent about Israeli policies, and we are not allowing these ultra far right and ultra far left lining up.
So my question to you, as somebody who lives and works on a major university campus, can you just highlight, we're coming gradually toward the end of our time. We have a few more questions that I'd like to address.
I just warmed up.
One of my favorite movies, I'm just getting warmed up. Sensible word. So we'll let you continue to get warm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to keep going, by the way. So let me ask you if you could identify a positive instance of deep, high-resolution Jewish-Muslim engagements on campus, the sort that you're referring to, where you felt that both groups felt illuminated and had their understanding deepened. It ideally should happen at universities every day. So could you point to an instance?
Many. Like one of the most regretful outcomes of Jewish-Muslim polarization, especially on college campuses, increasingly in many places, if there is no healthy relationship, Muslims are inviting validators, as I call them, self-hating Jews. Muslims are inviting disproportionate number of people who are going to validate their existing anti-Semitism, or anti-Zionism, or the anti-Israeli. People who are not even known in the Jewish community become a hero in the Muslim community. Natura Karta, Norman Finkelstein, like these people who are more than happy, with all due respect to their personalities, their scholarship, they are unhelpful to my community. They are just fueling the fire in my community, and in many Jewish circles, unfortunately, they return the favor. They invite self-hating Muslims or ex-Muslims. But can you imagine they're inviting an ex-Muslim who denounced Islam and who thinks the problem with Islam is the God of Islam, Allah is a fire-breathing dragon? You invite them as a resource for Islam and Muslims. Can you just see the lack of common sense in this over and over? But whenever and wherever, I can give specific examples, where the Muslim community and the Jewish community has some sort of a respectful relationship with one another, those speakers never show up. Those speakers never show up. Those books in the libraries of the Hillel and the Muslim community never shows up. So there is an ongoing conversation. I think, do you want me to give specific examples?
No, we understand. We can give, if you wish. I think what you're speaking to is the importance of high resolution, which is something that we talk about here all the time. High resolution means that when we take our students to Israel, we are also talking to them about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all the challenges. We are not simply giving them a tour of a perfect Disneyland Israel. So the same thing is called for when Jews and Muslims are engaging each other to actually dig deeper and to try to understand things as profoundly as we can.
And the success goes beyond one campus. Once you are known to be the resource person who seem to know something about that particular issue, many university campuses are emailing, is this speaker okay? Will it upset the Jewish community? Is this person criticizing Israel or are they vomiting anti-Semitism?
Yes.
And they rely on your expertise.
Right. No, I think it's extremely helpful, fraught and complicated as it is. So we're going to now move on to some of the questions that were solicited. We asked people to identify and to provide questions that they had. And I'm not going to be able to ask each and every one of them, but there definitely was a cluster of questions around looking forward to a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. People wondering aloud whether a one-state solution would be preferable, how each of you envision that or a two-state solution. Who do you ideally see as the individuals, the nations that should be part of the negotiation process? What role should the United States play, etc.? So if you could take, and I say that with full recognition that we could go an hour and a half at least just on this question, but to have the two of you here and not ask about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems like to very understatedly say quite a missed opportunity.
I'm going to
So
let
if you could address-
my brother Yossi answer his one-state, two-state solution. But we were talking earlier about these congressmen and women entering into Congress.
Yes.
My beloved state of North Carolina sent another interesting human being from Charlotte, North Carolina. His name is Congressman Harris. He comes from a very particular Christian communities who are not known that they love everybody. But he's in Congress now. His recent comments is no one state, no two state, one religion. The solution in Israel-Palestine is everybody has to convert to Christianity.
All right. Well, that's something we can all get on.
So, I deeply dislike the two-state solution. In fact, I loathe the two-state solution. I fear it, but I fear the one-state solution more. Maybe just barely. That's how deep my antipathy and fear is toward a two-state solution. But in the end, I come out reluctantly but passionately for a two-state solution precisely because I fear the alternative more. A one-state solution is no solution. A one-state solution is a dissolution of the state. And it is God forbid, turning Israel into Yugoslavia or Syria or Iraq, or any of these other dysfunctional multi-ethnic societies that were patched together from groups who hate each other. You can't bring Palestinians and Israelis into one state after a 100-year existential war. You can't, for that matter, you can't pretend to share Jerusalem. That's a whole other question. But I don't believe that a one-state solution is possible under any circumstances. A two-state solution, the problems that I have with the two-state solution begin with my emotional attachment to the land that is called the West Bank. And for me, it's not the West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria, as it is for I would say, most Israelis. That's what we call it. That's what it is. And it's certainly not occupied territory. For me, it's the land of Israel. The problem is that there's another people in that land who believe it's the land of Palestine. And so between the river and the sea, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, you have two conceptual territories. The land of Israel, all of it, including what is called the West Bank, and the land of Palestine, all of it, including what is the state of Israel. I don't like it. I don't want it, but there it is. And so I, as an Israeli, have one of two choices. I'm either going to continue this war another 100 years, or I'm going to try to do the solution that I don't want, which is to cut this beloved land into two states, this little land into two vulnerable states. My starting point for future negotiations is a frank acknowledgement by both sides that, to use Talmudic language, kula sheli, it's all mine. I have no problem when I see maps in the Palestinian Authority that don't have the name Israel on it, because my internal map, my emotional map, does not have the word Palestine on it. For me, the name Palestine is an affront. Emotionally, that's how I react. It's hard for me to say Palestine. But, as we say in Hebrew, ma lasot, what are you going to do? You have another people. It's another people there. I don't want to rule over them. I don't want to share my society with them. I don't want to have 45 Arab Knesset members in a future Knesset. I need separation. Again, not because I want it, and not because I consider it just. It is a profound act of injustice against Jewish history for us to give up Judea and Samaria. But I feel that I have no choice. Palestinians feel the same way about giving up what we call the State of Israel. And that's why I'm able to speak to Palestinians. And that's why I'm able to go around campuses with a Palestinian activist and say, I have no problem with your grandfather's key to your home, your lost home in the State of Israel. Because I have a key also. I have an emotional key, a historic key to Judea and Samaria. But if you're going to insist on implementing that key, and my side is going to insist on implementing our key, then we reduce this conflict to what it's been for the last 100 years, which is a zero-sum game. And I desperately want to seek an alternative to that zero-sum game. There may not be one. There may not be. After 100 years, you look at the conflict and you say, maybe there won't be a two-state solution. But I at least need to explore the possibilities.
Yes, I have a two-state solution myself, but unlike my brother Yossi, I'm not from Israel. I'm not Palestinian. So I speak as an American Muslim. And overwhelming majority of American Muslims are two-staters. Overwhelming majority. And if the possibility of two-state in the last 10 years could have been a lot closer than what it is now, we wouldn't have meetings. We wouldn't have these problems whatsoever. The fact that two-state solution is becoming more and more almost impossible, therefore a lot of people are turning into one-state solution or some other option.
No state solution.
No, or one religion solution. I didn't know this until this recent election cycle. But I want to highlight Yossi, and I don't think I'm biased in the saying that his book, My Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is an incredible gift to Muslims and Jews, but especially in North America. It's giving a very loyal account of what would a cosmic conceptual one state for everybody. You are not giving up your loyalties. But for ultimate justice, you have to do injustice to both sides. Both have to compromise in its implementation, in its actualization of these oldest mind story. I think he's trying something unique and powerful. It's an opportunity for us to take the spirit of this book and at least try it out here in the United States. American Jews and American Muslims, at least we can model and exemplify. What would a pro-Palestinian Muslim in America and pro-Israeli Jew in America conceptually honor each other's narratives, but actually come to the term that there's no solution other than two states.
And if I could just add one last word, which is that MLI not only brings Muslims into synagogues, but Jews into mosques. And God willing, in January, I'm coming on a 2-week tour of North American Islam. And so that's courtesy of MLI.
You actually anticipated the question that was asked, which is the extent to which the parallel program here is taking place in mosques, bringing people who are Jewish into mosques to speak about the collective of our narratives. I'm also struck, as both of you were speaking, oftentimes we think that engagement is about a self-dilution, that you have to dilute yourself in order to engage. And what you two have amply demonstrated is that is absolutely not the case. You gain nothing by diluting your own narrative. So that Yossi has been very clear about saying that to give up Hebron for him is like to give up a limb. It's not something which is, it's not casual. He doesn't regard Hebron and Yehuda and Shomron as being marginal to Israel. It is part and parcel of Israel. And for Palestinians and for American Muslims to be able to speak about the centrality that this land has to them is also extremely important. Otherwise, we're disingenuous and we have no chance of getting anywhere. So I want to just frame one other question, and then perhaps we'll just have, we'll conclude. People may want to just come up and say hello afterwards and follow up, and we'll certainly give space for that to happen.
Serve some Persian food, something.
And the Imam was asked if there was Persian food to be served somewhere. I believe in Great Neck there are such culinary opportunities. If that interests you. So, here is the way that I would like to frame it, and it's following up on the question of majority and minority. And it's so interesting to me the way that all of these dynamics intersect. So Yossi, member of our congregation, has raised the whole question of, I would call it, the implicit Ashkenazi-centric dimension of your life, of your own experience. And frankly, when we have spoken about Israel and about the need for Israel, there has been, certainly in the United States for decades, and it's changing, this framework of from Holocaust to rebirth. And speaking about the Holocaust as being a profoundly defining moment for the Jewish people, the Holocaust, nobody would deny the intensity and the widespread tragic impact that it's had, but at the same time, it's largely an Ashkenazi experience. And so the question is, when you are writing about your Palestinian neighbor, so let's say down the hill, and you're in your apartment, so the person is wondering, as a Mizrahi Sephardi, a Persian American Jew, where does that leave this individual whose community often feels that they are marginalized to the Ashkenazi majority here in the United States? There has certainly in Israel been a real marginalization of Mizrahi Jewry for the first decades of its existence. So if you could address that, where you believe the Mizrahi Sephardi impulse identity fits into the overarching Jewish narrative. Are you using that to some degree now as part of your mega narrative? And
So-
I actually have a follow-up with you about that as well. But just-
Well, I so much appreciate the question because it really goes to the heart of, I would say, my transition from being an American Jew to being an Israeli. I moved to Israel, as I mentioned earlier, in 1982. And the early 80s was actually the transition moment when Mizrahim entered the mainstream. It was the rise of Likud, and it was the rise of Begin, and the transformation of Israeli culture, especially music. And you really see the 80s as the pivotal moment when Israel finally became what it should be, which is a genuine reflection of the diversity of Israeli society. When my wife and I moved to Israel, we made a decision very, very early on to join a Mizrahi synagogue. We liked the singing better, and we really raised our kids there. And it's when I think of the kind of Judaism that I grew up with and the Judaism and the culture that I live in now, I feel frankly it's so much richer because Israel has finally come to terms with reflecting what we call the ingathering of the exiles. And so that has a necessary political component as well. It's not only a cultural component. And what I've tried to do in my book is present what I call a 21st century narrative on Zionism. And the questioner is absolutely right. American Jewry is still telling an outmoded 20th century story on Zionism. And that story is Eurocentric, It begins with the Kishinev pogrom, and it culminates in the Holocaust. The problem with that story is at least twofold. First of all, it doesn't reflect the majority of Israelis today. A majority of Israelis left or fled from or were pushed out of one part of the Middle East and moved to another part of the Middle East. Nothing to do with the Shoah. That's a majority of Israelis. And I think that when we tell a Holocaust-centered story about Israel, we leave ourselves vulnerable to the accusation of, oh, well, the Palestinians are paying the price for what Europe did to the Jews. Israel is not about the Holocaust. In fact, in our program, we do not take our participants to Yad Vashem. We may be the only Israel program in the history of the state that doesn't take them to Yad Vashem. And what I tell them is, if you're interested in the Shoah, go to the Washington Museum. We're here to teach you a story about 4,000 years of Jewish attachment to this land, the indigenousness of the Jewish people here, and the multiplicity of the Jewish people. And that's a story that we convey in our program and that I try to tell in the book. The other problem with telling a Eurocentric story is that my understanding of Zionism is that it's the meeting point between need, existential need, and longing. A 2,000-year story, an improbable story, of how a people that was dispersed in every corner of the world maintained a kind of vicarious indigenousness with the land it lost but never gave up. When we tell a Eurocentric Holocaust story, we are telling the story of the Zionism of emergency, the Zionism of need. We are not telling the story of Jewish longing. We have forgotten how to tell that story. And the story that we tell in MLI, and that I tried to tell in my book, is the Zionism of longing. That's the story we need to retell ourselves, our children, and the world, because that's a story we've lost.
And my attraction to Yossi and Shalom Hartman was precisely in their ability to tell that Zionism of longing story. Their ability and their success and sophistication of telling a Zionism in Israel, not only born out of Auschwitz, but out of Sinai. That story has a lot of potential to heal so many Jewish Muslim wounds. And for many participants, it was an incredible discovery to find how Sephardi Israeli society is. How food, music, and our collective conclusion is Allah has blessed the Ashkenazi community with so many things, but food is not one of them.
I did take Abdullah to the 2nd Avenue Deli recently, and it was a learning experience for him.
Ashkenazi food only works in a very sterile, particular lab, 2nd Avenue Deli. And therefore there is a lot more to do in that particular.
I'm trying to digest. So, of course, there's so much more that could be said. And, it shouldn't all come down to food. But if you had ever tasted my grandmother's stuffed cabbage, you don't even care what it was stuffed with, As you are speaking up more, I'm also thinking in terms of when we are creative and when our minds and our hearts are open, not in ways that can lead rapidly to self-destruction, but in ways that can lead to transformation. There are so many possibilities that are available. I am thinking of a kind of affinity that I don't know how much has been explored between Mizrahi Jews and some Muslims who have come to the United States and who are feeling marginalized and who are feeling that an entire Middle Eastern culture is being sort of relegated to secondary status. And so once we start engaging with deep resolution so much as possible, as the two of you have amply demonstrated, we certainly see. I'm going to conclude by just sharing 2 thoughts. So first, to put this in context for our congregation, when people hear about Jewish-Muslim engagements within the Jewish community, there is a range of reactions. There is support, there is disbelief, there is cynicism, etc. And I am reminding our community, by way of our own historical context, that Rabbi Gaxman, Allah Shalom, may he rest in peace, he broke a lot of barriers when he began to have serious engagements with the Catholic community, and beyond that, with Christian communities. And there was a great deal of resistance that he faced at that time, but he understood that the need for this engagement transcended whatever complicated resistance he would find. And so this conversation, I believe, should be seen in that context and this type of engagement. We all recognize what the pitfalls are. You've seen some of them. You've seen some of the disagreement. They didn't try to varnish over that. And yet you have also amply demonstrated, not just this morning, but over the course of the work that you've done together, how important this deep resolution engagements can be. And the second thing that I want to say is, you're looking back to our scripture. You have Yitzhak and you have Ishmael. Both are the sons of Abraham. And the two of them are separated from each other based on conflict, based on an incapacity to live together. And when do they come back together? They come back to bury their father. And every time I read that, I think of what a missed opportunity the Torah is describing. There is a pathos in the fact that they were apart until the death of their father brought them together. And so often we come together over tragedy, we come together to lament the past. And how uplifting is it to see that there is engagement between Yitzhak and Ishmael that is occurring each and every day, that we're not waiting for the tragedies, but that we are actually taking the brave steps to cross over the barriers and to engage each other profoundly. So thank you both for exemplifying that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So people want to come forward